is it bad to run with a rear foot strike? And the answer is no. So I want to introduce myself, guys. I'm Daniel. I'm one of the co-founders of Athletic Kinetics, and I co-run Fast Over 40, the program that really helps runners over 40 really regain their speed and become the best runners they can. Thanks so much for joining me on this Saturday morning. I think you're going to get a lot of value out of this short talk and the Q&As that we'll do and everything like that. And like I said, I'm kind of new to Facebook Live. I normally use Zoom for these things, so if something goes wrong, I apologize, and we'll fix it going forward. But I really wanted to go live today just to get in front of you guys, and many of you are members of this group, and you really haven't seen us or seen what we do, and so I wanted to just talk about some of the topics that are important to runners. And Footstrike is one of those ones that I see posted a lot about on the internet. And I see like on all the time on Instagram, and some people do a really good job of covering it, but some people also kind of give myths that really might not be true in research. And so I want to kind of cover what we know in research and why that's important, really. And so today's topic is demystifying footstrike, and we'll do some myth bustings and some discussion and that sort of thing. But if you have questions, feel free. You can message me. You can post them, and then at the end we can talk through them. I'll do some FAQs at the end as well. Some frequently asked questions, and if they're different, you have different questions, we can talk about that as well. But this is not going to be super long. I planned out something short for this first one, but I really wanted to just get on the computer and do some face-to-face with everyone. I also want to state up front, this is not medical advice. So ultimately, you need to see your doctor or your physical therapist for medical advice. This is this information that we've gathered and stuff that we know based on working with runners and the research we've done. All right, so let's talk about foot strike. So really, foot strike is a really basic concept, is what's happening when your foot hits the ground. So it is what position your foot is in when it hits the ground. And each foot strike is unique and different and can cause different things to happen throughout your body. And so when your foot hits the ground, there's ground reaction forces generated, and that's kind of basic physics. So there's force coming up through your legs into your body. And what happens there is when you put different foot strikes over that, you get different stresses going to different areas of the body. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about what that means and why that's important. But there's three basic foot strikes. There's rear foot strike, there's midfoot strike, and there's forefoot strike. So rear foot, midfoot, forefoot. And so you can really have thousands of different possible foot strikes in between all of those. You think of it kind of like a spectrum, but those are the ones we classify it into. So we do a big classification of foot strikes. So let's break down each one and kind of why each one is important. So let's start with a forefoot strike. So a forefoot strike means landing close to the ball of your foot. And it really, when your foot hits the ground when you're walking or running and it lands close to the ball of your foot, that's what a forefoot strike would be. A rear foot strike would be the opposite of that, so it'd be closer to the heel. So when your foot hits the ground, you're landing closer to your heel. And then a midfoot strike would be right in between that. So the middle of your foot is hitting the ground first. So a forefoot strike, really, there's different thoughts about forefoot strike. So many people think sprinters are the ones who run with forefoot strike. That's true often. And then that distance runners don't or sometimes do, and that's also true. So a forefoot strike is used by a plethora of different runners. It is the second most common foot strike. So rear foot strike is by far the most common, then forefoot strike, then midfoot strike. But the forefoot strike can decrease stress on the medial part of your knee. So that's the inside closer to the midline of your knee when compared to a rear foot strike. So that's an important distinction there. But it can potentially increase stress through your plantar fascia, which is the bottom of your foot, or that's a structure on the bottom of your foot, your patellofemoral joint, or kind of your kneecap joint. And it can especially increase stress through your Achilles tendon and your calf muscle. So really the posterior chain, the lower posterior chain of your body, it can increase stress through. It's suggested that it might be the most economical foot strike pattern, but that's not necessarily true. There's kind of mixed research on that. So some people have claimed that in research, and then others have said, wait, that might not actually be true. I think it's more of a, there's components to a forefoot strike with other parts of running mechanics that can make it a more advantageous running foot strike, but you don't have to run with a forefoot strike to have a very economical running gait. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later as well. Ultimately, with greater speed comes, greater speed and increased incline comes a shift to a forefoot strike. So and this is kind of common knowledge when you think about it, going up a hill, you're going to shift toward a forefoot strike generally. And when you run faster, like a sprinter, you're generally going to shift toward a forefoot strike. It's not always true. Some people will still use a rear foot strike or a midfoot strike, but generally. So that's kind of a really quick summary of forefoot strike. I now kind of want to jump into rear foot strike, and we'll talk a little bit about that, and then later on answer some questions about that. So rear foot strike shifts the shock absorption, or really the forces to your body, more toward the medial portion or the inside, closer to your midline of your knee. And so it's also been thought that actually rear foot strike causes more shock absorption through your muscles. Your muscles actually respond more and absorb more shock when you do a rear foot strike. But there's kind of debate about this because there's also more force generated through your body during a rear foot strike. So there's a little more force generated during a rear foot strike than any of the other foot strikes. And so is it just your muscles absorbing more shock, or is it truly that your muscles better absorb shock with a rear foot strike? That's kind of up for debate from what I have seen in the research. But it's the most common foot strike, and that is by far the most common foot strike. So I've seen studies that say up to 85% of runners run with a rear foot strike. I don't know if it's always that high, but it's definitely the most common. And a lot of runners think they're running with another foot strike. They'll say, I'm a midfooter or forefoot striker, and they're actually a rear foot striker. So rear foot striking is not bad, and that's something I want to emphasize because that gets a really bad rap in running. But a question I often hear is, should I change my foot strike from a rear foot strike? And the short answer is probably not, or no, right up front if you're just going to try to go do it. But the key is really every runner has a foot strike that fits their body best for their time they are running right now. And so that's going to change throughout your life and your body changes. But the key is really finding what is best for you and what is best for your body and what makes your body feel the best. And sometimes that's going to be a rear foot strike, and that's not a bad thing. So we'll talk a little bit more about rear foot strike as we get into some of the frequently asked questions. But now I want to jump into midfoot strike, which is kind of the third major foot strike we're going to cover. And this is in between a rear foot and a forefoot, and it's really shock attenuation is distributed as such. So somewhere in between those two. So you're going to have some force through your medial knee. I mean, no matter what you will, but you're going to have kind of like the rear foot strike, you're getting more force through the medial knee. You'll have some through the medial knee and then some through the Achilles, calf, plantar fascia, kind of in between the forefoot and the rear foot strike. Now, this foot strike is more rare for sure. So I saw a couple of studies that said, there's something, I have to look back, but something around 5% of runners might run with a midfoot strike. So it's definitely not the most common, but there definitely are elite runners who do. I've seen video of Eliud Kipchoge, who just won the marathon during the Olympics, and I've seen videos of him running with a midfoot strike at times. I think it varies some, so I don't want to say he's only a midfoot striker, but definitely some elite athletes do, some runners do. It's a very economical foot strike, but again, not the end-all be-all. It can limit stress through certain areas of your body, but we're going to talk more about that a little bit later. So that's kind of a quick summary of three major foot strikes, but I want to jump into some frequently asked questions I often hear. So one of the really common ones, and we've kind of answered this already, but I want to talk more about it, is it bad to run with a rear foot strike? And the answer is no. It's not bad to run with a rear foot strike, but that's kind of only true if there are not other things going on with your gait that are not efficient that are causing you to run with a rear foot strike. So let me say that a little bit better. If you are overstriding, for example, that is not great because it's going to automatically put on your brakes. It's going to put more stress through your shin, through your knee, through your hip, through your low back. Overstriding is not really a advantageous way to run. And oftentimes, if we're overstriding, we're going to have a rear foot strike. So I want to kind of separate those two things. Rear foot striking is not necessarily bad, but if it's accompanied with something in your biomechanics that's not good, like a overstride, then it might not be the best thing for you. It can increase stress. It can decrease your efficiency. So that's the difference there. Rear foot strike, not bad. Other biomechanical issues that cause rear foot strike, not good. Another one I often get is, should I use the same foot strike all the time? And it's kind of it's you can't really answer that perfectly, but the answer is no. It's really impossible to use the same foot strike all the time. Your foot strike's going to change as you race and as you do different things, as you age. As you're running a single race, if you're going uphill, you're going to be more of a probably shift more to a forefoot. If you're going downhill, you'll shift toward a rear foot probably. As you're running on a flat ground, you might shift to a different area, and then even throughout that, your foot strike's going to change slightly. But in general, we do all have a foot strike that our body prefers, and we'll kind of run with that repetitively. So within that, there are ways to vary your foot strike that we think are pretty good, and this is varying your foot strike consciously. So there's natural variance, which is what we talked about. So you're running uphill or downhill and things change. Then there's conscious variance, meaning like you're like, I'm going to try a different foot strike. And research does not suggest permanently changing your foot strike. In fact, that can be detrimental. You can overload a part of your body that's not used to that stress, and you can get injured. So if you went from a rear foot strike straight to a forefoot strike, some runners do it fine, but it increases your risk for injury because your calves and your Achilles and your plantar fascia are not used to that stress, and you can overload it very easily. So permanently changing, not good, but varying your foot strike in a run. So what we'll give runners sometimes, we'll say, you know what, experiment. So go on a 12-minute run, or let's do a 16-minute run, 16-minute run for 4 minutes with a rear foot strike, 4 minutes trying to run with a forefoot strike, and then 4 minutes with a midfoot strike, then run for 4 minutes with whatever foot strike feels best to you. And that's a good exercise to vary your foot strike and really vary the forces through your body. You just don't want to permanently change your foot strike that quickly. And so that shouldn't be something that causes injury if you do it. If it does, you probably had an underlying injury you weren't aware of, and your body kind of responded to that by making you aware of it. But that's a good way to vary your foot strike, and can really be a good deal to get different forces distributed through different areas and experiment really with what your body feels best at the time with. And another one I often get, another frequently asked question is, can I change my foot strike? And we kind of already covered that. Research does not recommend changing your foot strike most of the time. So it cites you can get injured much more easily for those reasons we talked about with the changing of the stress in the body suddenly. There is some research that's come out that suggested that if there's an injured runner and they are struggling with a certain type of injury, you can unload that injury by changing your foot strike if you're working with a medical professional or someone who knows exactly what they're doing with this. So let me give you an example of that. Say someone has Achilles tendonitis, right? We know that a forefoot strike puts more stress through their Achilles. So we want to unload that while they're in rehab. This is not just unloading that. They're in rehab working on that Achilles issue. And to unload that, you could theoretically run with a midfoot strike or a rear foot strike for a certain time period, and that might unload that and allow it to heal better. Same thing goes for the knee. Say you're having medial knee pain, and you found out, oh, I can change that by running with a forefoot strike. So you can do that, and that can unload that area. But what we want to be careful of, again, is you're not developing an overuse injury now in your Achilles, right? So it definitely is something that needs to be done supervised and with a medical professional and coinciding with rehab at the same time. But we've seen research that can be a viable thing if you're changing your foot strike in that way. So that was just a ton of information about changing foot strike. But ultimately, what the research suggests is no, don't change your foot strike. We really like varying foot strike consciously or subconsciously, so running on different terrains and then consciously changing your foot strike on short periods of your run to stress different areas of your body, but not for prolonged periods of time. And then changing your foot strike could be valuable in a rehab program if you're rehabbing from injury. So that's kind of the knowledge we have, the research that we found on foot strike and changing it. Let's see. So I want to talk a little bit about some examples and about when changing your foot strike can be beneficial. So we found that, we talked about this a little bit, but when we change biomechanics, foot strike can change. That's just kind of natural. So when we find a detrimental biomechanics. So we do a running gait analysis with every runner we work with, a really in-depth one. And when you look at someone's running mechanics, oftentimes there's little tweaks you can make. Sometimes there's big tweaks you can make, but often little tweaks you can make that can make them a better runner. And so we often see someone with an overstride. And so if someone's overstriding, we talked about how that can lead to more of a rear foot strike. Not that the rear foot strike is bad, the overstride would be bad, right? So we then do some running drills. We shift them so that they're now running without an overstride. It makes them more efficient. Sometimes that will result in them slightly changing their foot strike. So if they were not going to naturally be a rear foot striker, but they were rear foot striking because of an overstride, maybe they shift to more of a forefoot strike, maybe shift to more of a midfoot strike. And we've seen that before. And that has to be very carefully done, because obviously if you're changing foot strike, you're going to increase stress on another area of your body. But typically, if you're correcting overstride, it's going to decrease your injury risk anyway, because you're then not putting all that excessive force through your body. And so that's something we've seen, is changing other mechanics resulting in a foot strike change that can be beneficial. And then some runners change what type of running they're doing. So I use this example. When I was first really getting into running gait analysis, I was experimenting a lot with my wife. She was a collegiate runner, and she ran the 100 and the 200 and the 400 at a really high level, and she was a really fast sprinter, right? So she is running on her toes all the time, and that's really all she ever did. And so when she got out of college, she didn't want to sprint as much. She wanted to do some other runs, and so we'd go on the mile run, 2 mile run, that kind of thing. And she's always on her forefoot, really like a dramatic forefoot striker, which is not a bad thing necessarily, but what we did then was we were like, okay, I wonder if your body would want to run with something slightly different, and we experimented with different foot strikes, and what we found is it was actually more comfortable to run longer distances with more of a forward and midfoot. So it wasn't a dramatic forefoot. It was a kind of like in between a forefoot and midfoot strike. And so that was really what felt best with her for more of a mile, 2 mile run, as opposed to the 100, 200, 400. And so what was happening was she was so used to doing that, that foot strike had been ingrained in her body over and over and over by her nervous system. And by exposing her to different foot strikes, we found, oh, this is not exactly what she wanted. Now, it wasn't a drastic shift to a rear foot strike or something like that, but it was a slight shift backwards, and that really actually helped decrease some of her pain that she had in her feet when she ran longer, and that sort of thing. So that's just an example of how changing foot strike can be beneficial, especially when it's a slight change and accompanied with other biomechanical changes. So that's really mostly what I have for you guys. If you guys have any questions, I'm gonna hang around, and I can answer questions if you want to. I'm not actually sure how Facebook Live works with questions. If you want to send me a message or comment, you can definitely do that, and I can answer them on here if I can find where those are. But I do want to say, kind of in closing, while we're doing that, if you're a runner who is really, really determined to get better, and you really want a transformation, you want to begin transforming your body and turning into a better, faster, stronger runner, one who's injury resistant, run who can really, our thing is really running the fastest mile that you can possibly run, then you can definitely talk with us. We can get on the phone, we can chat about that. We can chat about your goals, what you're hoping to achieve, and then we do have a running program.